Hello humans, Master Flex here, bringing you the low quality content you deserve, and today we will finally be going over that poll I posted a couple days ago, where I wanted to see, were you guys interested in reverse power creep discussion, or a shadow banning of cards discussion? And what won is Shadowbans, which I'm actually a really big fan of, because I think this topic is way more interesting than reverse power creep. That being said, I can go over the reverse power creep as well, but both of those videos are something a little different, if you can't tell, because while they are a Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussion, they work much more as ban list theory than they do, like, actual card, like, gameplay discussion, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, they're always saying, wins the ban list, wins the ban list, wins the ban list, but no one ever stops to think, how's the ban list, you know? There's just nothing like that, so today I decided, you know what? Maybe I should go over the idea of a shadow banned card, and this will also help people understand that the semi-limited list actually has a function, and sometimes I think the OCG drastically overutilizes it, and the TCG drastically underutilizes it. But regardless of that, let's just go into it. So, a shadow ban. If you've been on Twitter before, you know exactly what a shadow ban is. If you ever post any provocative art or call Elon Musk a poopy head, you'll notice you get no interactions at all. It's almost like you're not even a part of the site, and that is called a shadow ban. You technically have access to the site and you can technically use it, but because your content is being so thoroughly suppressed, it's no different if you were banned or not, and that is called a shadow ban. Basically, while you do have access to whatever, you don't actually get to participate in it, and it's the same thing with Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. So we'll put up the three most obvious examples I could find: Destiny Hero Malicious, Reborn Tengu, and Guardian Elma. So, if Tengu or Malicious go to 1, these cards are literally unplayable. Their only effect is to utilize another copy of themselves out of the deck. So if you limit them, it is not different at all from banning them. Like, even a little bit, because no one will put a card in their deck list that can't be used. And that's an example of a very, very, very obvious shadow ban, but it also goes to Guardian Elma. Its only effect is when it's normal summoned, you can equip an equip spell from your graveyard to it, but it can only be summoned while Guardian Elma is face up, a card that is banned. So this card literally cannot be used at all, but you can put it in your deck list. Like, these are the most obvious shadow bans I can go over. But obviously you can see there's a lot more time left to this video, so this discussion is going to start getting a lot more complex, and we'll take it the next step up, where I call them half shadow bans. These ones are kind of unique from all three of these examples I'm going to give, because they can be used and utilized whether at 1 or whatever, but at multiples, they serve a completely different function. Zodiac Wrap here is probably the most obvious example of these three, where it's malicious, but it also has another effect besides being malicious. So obviously, at 1, half of its effect is shadow ban, and the other half is totally fine. That's an example. But when it comes to less obvious examples like Daigusto Emerald, at 1, the text on this card is exactly the same. But at 2 or more, there's a third button right here that says, this card is at infinite copies in your deck list, because one Daigusto Emerald can put back the other, and that kind of deck building can lead to some real stupid nonsense that you could entirely avoid by just putting it at 1. And then finally, Lunalight Tiger, I think, is the most recent example of this, somewhere around Emerald or Tiger. This card at 1 allows Tiger Chick to be a line of play, and allows Lunalights to actually function as a deck list and archetype. However, while Tiger was at 2 or 3, that's when this deck was actually allowed to be good. People just assumed back then, like, I'm thoroughly convinced people never knew why Lunalight was good. You needed multiple cards, you needed multiple copies of this card in your deck list, because any combo that was actually oppressive needed you to control 2 Tigers. It was just that simple. And because of that, the best boards are now out of the question when it's at 1. So its most oppressive part goes away. So it's like a shadow ban of that. And these are kind of a more... This is where, like, these three will be a buffer zone to explain shadow bans can occur in a more complex way than you might initially realize. And a lot of the time, these kinds of shadow bans are best put at 1, because otherwise they get all their bonus effects that aren't even written on the card, except Zoo. This one's written quite literally right here. So, obviously this theory can be more complex, but then this is where I like to call, if these are hard shadow bans, and these are half shadow bans, these I like to call soft shadow bans. And this is where it begins to get a little weird, and where the semi-limit list actually needs to come in. Because these two are very obvious on how they interact with cards, but soft shadow bans are considerably different, because while you can utilize them like hard, you can put them in your deck list, and they still have their initial intended effect. When put at a number like 1, all utility that could possibly exist from this card in any form of gameplay, whether it be super casual or super competitive, is completely eliminated. And this mostly occurs with non-engine cards. I think the most blatant example of this is Sekka's Light. Sekka's Light at 1 can still be used. However, no one in their right mind would play 1 Sekka's Light in a deck list like that when they are skipping every other spell and trap card in the entire game for 1 Sekka's Light. At 1, this card serves absolutely zero function to literally anyone. And this extends to these examples right here. Phantom Skyblazer has never been a part of any deck, but while it was at 3, you could actually account for the card and build strategies involving it. But the very second that went to 1, it just became completely useless, and there was no way to even utilize it, because it was a random sack draw. It didn't matter. Gamma and Tour Guide are, I think, some very, very simple examples of this. Outside of Tour Guide for Burning Abyss and Gamma for actual Psy-Frames, these cards at 1 are not different from being banned. And you can see why I was saying, like, shadow bans like this can't really occur if it's engine, because if you notice, in those two decks, these two cards are engine pieces. Otherwise, they get to be shadow banned. Like, no other deck in the entire game can actually utilize them. And I guess the greater discussion is that a problem or not, and I would say yes, it is. Because a lot of the time, they don't need to be shadow banned. I think Gamma is the most egregious example as of late, where you took this hand trap out of the game that not only was not super effective as a hand trap, it was more effective as a going second tool. It was one of the only hand traps that could counter Shifter and Droll, cards that are very clearly not wanting to be addressed. So putting this at 1 said this card is out of your deck list against 2 hand traps that don't really have counters otherwise, I think was a miserable mistake. Like, sure, you could make Baron with it, but that really wasn't the importance of Gamma, and I think it was like, valued how powerful that really was, because there was counterplay to that. But regardless, the game suffers. I would argue the game actually suffers from Gamma being at 1. Like, it is made slightly worse because there isn't any real thing besides I Called by the Grave or whatever to stop those two. And it's just not a great thing to do, because when you're taking cards out of this, like this, out of the game, it really does reduce. Like, I remember the OCG loves to say, like, the TCG list is way too restrictive, and when you actually account for all the shadow bans that happen, it makes a lot more sense. Because just because a card's at 1 doesn't mean it's actually usable. And that's, like, the greatest importance of understanding why shadow bans aren't really that great to use unless it's absolutely necessary, because you are just banning these cards. There's no difference between this at 1 or 0. There's no difference. And, like, Tour Guide, up until, like, 2020, this card was completely unusable in anything not Burning Abyss. And that was kind of a problem because it was like it was a generic Fiend support, which at the time, Fiends were one of the most populated types with the least amount of support. It was really weird. So that wasn't a great thing. And even then, it's like, it doesn't really drastically increase the power level of anything it's in. So it was like, why is this card at 1? Now with Unchained, it actually gets to perform at its, like, natural intended level. But, like, if you go back to, like, putting it at 1, it becomes completely useless again. Which is not any different for banning it. So that kind of defeats the point of hitting it, because another really dumb thing about Shadowbans is they are naturally a feedback loop. When a card is at 1 and is rendered entirely useless, that means it's not worthy of being at 1. But if you've decided at 3 it's too powerful, then you have to hit it. And if you notice, at 1 it's useless, at 3 it's too powerful. If only there was a whole number that could fit in between there that would actually have a mathematical effect in competitive play. Oh yeah, it's 2. So, unironically, while I think the OCG is way too generous with what they semi-limit, I think the TCG is the opposite, where they do everything in their power to never utilize the semi-limit list, and it creates a bunch of unnecessary shadow bans. Like, I'm gonna be totally honest, plenty of cards could actually just be at 2, and they would be effective hits, because a lot of how the TCG plays are in these larger tournaments with much more rounds, where the semi-limits of a deck will actually begin to take effect, because while in one game it might not be that noticeable, over the course of many games it will become very obvious how having one less copy of that card affects how you play. Which is why I think, like, originally I was, like, abolisher of the semi-limit list until I started, like, actually observing these shadow bans, and it kind of made me realize, no, the semi-limit list not only has a function, it actually has a very underutilized function. Because I'm going to be totally honest, Gamma never needed to go to 1. Like, if you are scared of any of these cards, there's no reason to put them at 1, because that's just banning them. Try them at 2 first. And if they're still too powerful, it probably means they're engine cards. And engine cards are totally fine to put to 1 or even 0. But if they're not that, the semi-limit list needs to be utilized more. And I think the TCG has even picked up on that, because we've got a drastic increase in semi-limits as of late. But I will say, like, these mainly affect non-engine cards. Like, that's what I'm kind of looking over these for, because outside of this and its intended deck, they're just generic support that if you put them to 1 become completely useless. So it's not particularly interesting to put them at 1. But that's kind of what I wanted to go over. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you, like, learned something. I know there's so much discussion about how the semi-limited list is, like, it's the most evil thing ever. It, like, pours milk in first before cereal. Like, it's an awful, awful creature. But in truth, it's a part of the ban list that is designed to keep things like this from happening, where you can just ban a card by limiting it. And kind of like other versions of that. I think it needs to be utilized much more than it is. That being said, if you're going to use the semi-limit list, use it properly. Don't just put random nothing sandwich cards on there that don't actually matter. I think the perfect example is Runic Fountain, a card that is searchable by every quick play spell in that deck, and also many of the versions playing it only play 2. Like, don't waste energy on that. Use it for cards like these. That's what, if anything, the semi-limit list is for, is to keep shadow bans from happening, not so you can artificially create a hit without actually doing anything. I think that's when the semi-limit list is at its worst. I think the semi-limit list is at its best when it's, like, trying to keep these from being completely useless. Same with, like, malicious and whatnot. That's where the semi-limit list really should come in, and probably where it would be the best. But yep, that's about it for me. Thank you all for watching, and remember, Master Dinner Flex will take your soul.